It was one of those mornings that felt perfect for nothing more than sipping coffee and watching the world wake up. I had just stepped onto my front porch, mug in hand, when the sun hit the leaves of the maple tree in my yard just right, scattering golden patterns across the driveway. Birds chirped lazily, my neighbor across the street was hauling in his newspaper, and the faint scent of freshly mown grass drifted over from the Johnsons' lawn. Life was simple, quiet, suburban, and I loved it. I had lived in this neighborhood for a few years and had always been aware of the HOA, mostly because of the occasional letter about trimming hedges, repainting fences, or parking your car in the right spot. Mostly harmless stuff, nothing that ever demanded real attention. In fact, I had learned to glance at those notices, sigh, and then forget about them entirely. My life didn't revolve around HOA rules, and honestly, I liked it that way. And then the black SUV appeared. It rolled slowly down the street, tires crunching over the gravel, and parked directly in front of my house like it was staking a claim. I frowned, setting my coffee mug down, curiosity instantly mixed with a strange sense of unease. Two figures stepped out, dark uniforms, hats pulled low, and the kind of serious expressions that didn't seem to belong in a place where kids were still playing hopscotch. The taller one started walking toward me, badge clipped to his chest, clipboard in hand. The way he moved, deliberate and precise, reminded me more of a scene from a TV procedural than my quiet Saturday morning. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm, almost polite, but the slight edge made it clear that politeness didn't mean flexibility. "We need to see your ID." I blinked again. My brain felt like it had hit a sudden pause. "Excuse me?" I asked, trying to keep my tone steady while my stomach did a nervous flip. He repeated himself, this time with less patience. "We need to see your ID, sir. Please comply." I hesitated, glancing at my neighbors who had started to notice the strange visitors. Some peered out from behind their curtains, a few cautiously stepped onto their porches. I noticed Mr. Henderson, who always bragged about knowing everything about neighborhood regulations, leaning against his fence, eyes wide. Even he looked confused. My mind raced. Was this some kind of misunderstanding? Or worse, a prank? Maybe I had accidentally angered the HOA in some way I didn't know about, missed a tiny fine, or failed to paint my mailbox a slightly different shade. It all seemed ridiculous, yet the threat in his voice was real enough. "I think there's been a mistake," I started, my voice sounding weaker than I wanted. "I'm not part of your HOA." The taller officer didn't flinch. His partner, a shorter figure with arms crossed like a linebacker, stepped a little closer, narrowing the space between us. "Rules are rules. We need to verify your identity before you proceed." My heart rate kicked up, a mix of fear, confusion, and disbelief making it hard to even stand still. I tried to laugh it off, but it came out as a strangled chuckle. "I live here, I have property papers, I'm not a member of your HOA, this doesn't make sense." The taller one leaned in slightly, tone turning sharper. "Refuse, and you'll be arrested for trespassing." I froze, arrested, for trespassing, in my own driveway. My neighbors were fully watching now, some whispering, some holding back laughter, some clearly worried. I stared at the uniform, the badge, the clipboard, and the serious expression on his face, trying to reconcile the absurdity with the threat that now loomed over me like a storm cloud. I wanted to tell them I'd call the real authorities, but something told me that escalation might backfire. Instead, I took a deep breath, trying to calm the panic that threatened to take over. My coffee sat forgotten on the railing, the steam rising slowly in the cool morning air, completely ignored as I faced these two strangers who had turned my ordinary morning into a nightmare. And then I realized something even more absurd. I wasn't part of their HOA, I had no obligations to these people, and yet here they were, demanding my ID, threatening my freedom, and acting as though my front yard was some kind of crime scene. A surreal mix of fear, confusion, and disbelief settled over me. I didn't know what would happen next. All I knew was that my quiet morning, my safe little suburban life, had just exploded into a scenario that felt ripped straight out of a dark comedy. And just as I opened my mouth to speak, the taller officer leaned closer, his eyes locked on mine, and said, in a tone that made my blood run cold, "If you don't show us your ID, we'll have to take further action." My mind was spinning. I stared at the officer, trying to process what he had just said. "Further action?" I repeated, my voice trembling slightly despite my effort to stay calm. My heart felt like it was thudding inside my chest, loud enough that I was certain the entire street could hear it. "Yes," he said, as if that explained everything. His partner stood silently behind him, arms crossed, watching me like I was some misbehaving child about to break the rules. The air was tense, thick, and heavy, like walking into a horror movie where everyone else already knows the ending except you. I took a step back, my brain scrambling for logic. "Look, I don't even belong to your HOA," I said, hoping reason would reach them. I live here, I have my property papers, I have never agreed to join this association. The taller officer didn't budge. He leaned forward slightly, his expression almost predatory. Rules are rules, we have the authority to enforce them, your compliance is mandatory. I blinked. Enforce them, authority? You can't just arrest someone for walking in their own driveway. He didn't answer. Instead, his partner took a step closer, shoulders squared like a linebacker ready to tackle me. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Give us your ID now or we escalate. My stomach lurched. The words didn't make sense. I had never heard of HOA officers being able to detain or arrest someone. Not in real life, not in my neighborhood, not anywhere. Yet here I was, frozen on my porch, facing two strangers who seemed to think they could. I glanced toward my neighbors for help. Some of them were peeking cautiously from behind their fences, unsure whether to intervene or call the police. Others whispered among themselves, clearly unsettled but keeping their distance. Even Mr. Henderson, who normally had a smug comment ready for everything, was silent, eyes wide, gripping the top of his fence as though it were a lifeline. I swallowed hard, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Humor was the only thing keeping me from panicking. I must have moved into some parallel universe where HOA officers are now law enforcement. I muttered under my breath, loud enough for the nearest neighbor to hear. I think they chuckled quietly. At least someone found it funny. I held out my hands in a placating gesture. Listen, I'm happy to cooperate, but I'm telling you the truth. I'm not part of your HOA. I don't even know your rules. You're making a mistake. The taller officer squinted at me as though I had just revealed a secret code. Mistake or not, we are required to verify your identity. If you refuse, consequences follow. My pulse was pounding. Consequences? What kind of consequences? I could feel my palms sweating, gripping the railing for stability. Every instinct told me to call someone, anyone, but something about their demeanor made me pause. One wrong move and I wasn't sure what could happen. Then the shorter officer, the one standing silently behind, started circling slightly, cutting off potential escape routes. My mind was in overdrive, trying to think 5 steps ahead. How could two strangers, dressed in uniforms, claim authority over my property without proof? How had it come to this surreal confrontation? I tried reasoning again. Look, I can show you my property papers. I can prove I'm not part of your HOA. We can resolve this like adults. The taller officer's eyes narrowed, scanning my hands and my face. Your proof does not absolve you from providing identification now. I could feel the tension rising, not just in me but around the neighborhood. A few cars slowed down on the street. Kids on bicycles stopped mid-pedal, watching the strange scene unfold. My quiet Saturday morning had turned into a public standoff, complete with audience. And that's when it hit me, these officers were serious. They expected me to comply, and their calm confidence suggested they believed they could enforce compliance no matter how absurd. My chest tightened. I couldn't give in, but I also couldn't risk escalating into something I didn't fully understand. I clenched my jaw and took a deep breath. Humor and disbelief mingled with fear. Okay, I said carefully, I'm not showing my ID. You're asking something impossible. Let's figure this out without anyone getting in trouble. The taller officer's expression didn't change, but I noticed a flicker in his eyes, a hint of doubt, maybe, or irritation. I had no idea if it would help, but I knew I had to hold my ground. The stage was set for a standoff. Two strangers claiming authority, me refusing compliance, neighbors watching silently. My mind raced. Was this going to end peacefully, or was it about to spiral into chaos? I didn't know the answer. All I knew was that my quiet morning, the coffee, the sunshine, the suburban calm was gone. And that's when the shorter officer leaned forward and said something that made my blood run cold. Refuse, and we'll have no choice but to take you in. I froze for a moment, staring at the two officers as they stared back. My brain was screaming, this is insane, walk away, call the cops. But part of me knew that any sudden move could escalate things. My heart pounded in my chest, my coffee long forgotten on the porch railing, cooling in the crisp morning air. I tried to take a calm, rational breath. Look, I said, forcing my voice to sound steady even though my knees felt like jelly, I'm happy to cooperate, but I'm telling you the truth. I don't belong to your HOA, I have the deeds, I have proof you're making a mistake. The taller officer didn't flinch. His eyes locked on mine like he was trying to read my soul, and I swear I could see a hint of impatience flicker across his expression. The shorter one stepped slightly closer, and I noticed the way he shifted his weight, ready to move if needed. The tension was suffocating. I took another deep breath, trying to think fast. Would it help if I showed you my property records? Or maybe contact someone in the HOA proper? I tried to keep my tone friendly, reasoning with them like they were coworkers having a very intense disagreement rather than strangers threatening my freedom. The taller officer's lips pressed into a thin line. "Your cooperation is required immediately," he said, as if saying it louder would somehow make it true. I couldn't help it, I chuckled nervously. "Cooperation for what? I live here, I haven't broken any rules, and frankly, if you're trying to intimidate me, it's not working very well." The words hung in the air. I noticed my neighbors shifting, some whispering to each other, clearly torn between fear and amusement. One elderly woman peeked out from behind her lace curtains and muttered, "I can't believe this is happening." The taller officer leaned in slightly, and I noticed something in his demeanor that made me pause, a flicker of frustration, maybe because I wasn't reacting the way he expected. He expected fear, compliance, maybe even panic. Instead, I was standing my ground, awkwardly humorously but firmly. "Refuse to comply and we have no choice but to take action," he said again, the threat now repeated so many times that it felt like a mantra. I swallowed hard, trying to stay composed. "Action, you mean arrest? For what? Trespassing in my own driveway?" My voice wavered slightly, betraying the fear underneath the sarcasm. The shorter officer shifted, arms crossed, like he was about to say something. "Rules are rules," he muttered. "Everyone must follow the procedures." I blinked. Procedures? What procedures? I had never signed anything, I didn't even know these people. I looked toward my neighbors for help, but they were frozen, some on phones, some just staring. One teenager slowly raised his phone and started recording. I silently thanked him. At least there would be evidence if this went sideways. I tried another approach, hoping reason would prevail. "Look, I understand rules are important," I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. "But you can't enforce something on someone who isn't part of your organization. I have my property records here. I can show you exactly what the HOA covers and what it doesn't." For a moment there was silence. The tension was so thick I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. My palms were sweaty, my stomach tied in knots, but I kept my composure. I refused to give in. Then I added, a little humor creeping in despite the situation. "I mean, I'm all for keeping the neighborhood in order, really. I love neat lawns as much as the next person. But if you try to arrest me for existing in my own house, I might start questioning your training." Something flickered in the taller officer's eyes, a micro-expression of annoyance or maybe doubt. He glanced at his partner, then back at me. It was subtle, but it gave me a tiny sliver of hope. Maybe they weren't fully prepared for someone to stand up calmly, armed with logic, and just exist without fear. I tightened my jaw, trying to stay calm. My neighbors were watching now, phones out, the tension building like a pressure cooker. It was a strange kind of power, knowing that someone was witnessing this ridiculous standoff. For the first time, I realized I wasn't completely alone. But just as I thought I might start turning the tide, the taller officer leaned in again, his voice low and threatening. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. Show your ID now or we will escalate this situation." My stomach dropped again. Escalate? What did that even mean? I felt trapped. This wasn't normal, this wasn't legal. But the tension, the fear, and the absurdity kept me alert, every nerve on edge. I squared my shoulders and looked him directly in the eye. "I'm not showing my ID because I don't have to. I live here, I have proof. And you are not real authority." The taller officer's eyes narrowed. He opened his mouth, probably to argue, but I could see hesitation creeping in. My words had landed, even if he didn't want to admit it. And that's when I realized this confrontation wasn't over, not by a long shot, it was only just beginning. I knew I couldn't just stand there forever. The two officers weren't backing down, and each second that passed made me feel more trapped. My mind raced, trying to figure out how to prove I wasn't part of their HOA without escalating the situation. I glanced down at my porch table, my laptop was there, my property documents stacked neatly, and my phone buzzing with notifications from concerned neighbors. I decided my first step was to grab proof. Carefully, I stepped past the black SUV, my eyes never leaving the taller officer. My hands shook slightly as I retrieved my property deed and HOA boundary maps from my briefcase. I spread the papers across the railing, making sure everything was visible. "This is my property," I said, holding the deed up like it was a shield. "I live here, I am not part of your HOA. Look at this, your boundaries don't even include my house." The taller officer glanced at the papers briefly, then back at me. His expression didn't change. The shorter one stepped slightly closer, crossing his arms, but I noticed a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Maybe they weren't expecting me to actually know what I was doing. I realized I needed more evidence. I started scrolling through my HOA emails and records on my phone. Every notice, every letter, every fine, none of it matched these people's claims. My pulse quickened as I realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding. Something felt off. These officers weren't legitimate. They were trying to intimidate me, plain and simple. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "I'm showing you proof. I have the right to be here. I am not a member of your association. You can't threaten me with arrest." The taller officer frowned. "Verification is required. You must comply." I grit my teeth. "Comply with what? You're not real. You're threatening me based on nothing." The tension thickened. I could see some of my neighbors starting to whisper, unsure of whether to intervene or call the police. A few had already taken out their phones. I silently thanked them. At least there would be witnesses if these two decided to push their bluff further. Feeling a little more confident, I walked down my driveway toward the sidewalk, holding my papers up. "See? Look at these records. I've done my research. You have no authority over me." The shorter officer took a cautious step back. I noticed it and realized I might be gaining some ground. Their confidence wasn't absolute. It was built on the assumption that everyone would comply without question. But here I was, standing firm, armed with evidence. I decided to push a little further. I went over to my neighbor's house, Mrs. Patel, who always had a keen eye for details, and asked if she had ever seen these officers in the neighborhood before. She peeked out her window, squinting, then shook her head. "Never, that doesn't look right." I smiled inwardly. That was all the confirmation I needed. These people weren't legitimate. They were imposters, relying on fear and appearances to intimidate residents. My pulse slowed slightly as a surge of determination replaced some of the fear. I walked back to the porch, holding my documents like a shield, and faced the two officers. "Listen carefully. You have no authority over me. You're threatening a homeowner with no legal grounds. Step back or I call the authorities immediately." For a brief moment, they exchanged glances. Something passed between them, maybe frustration or realization that I wasn't going to fold. I could see the slightest hesitation in the taller officer's posture, a micro-expression that betrayed uncertainty. The shorter officer looked at the SUV, then back at me. His arms were still crossed, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. I had broken the first part of their bluff. I wasn't intimidated. Still, I knew the confrontation wasn't over. I had evidence, yes, but they were bold enough to try anything. I needed a plan. I needed to protect myself, document everything, and make sure there was a paper trail if this escalated further. I reached for my phone again, opening the camera app, pretending to video call an HOA support line while discreetly recording the scene. The taller officer noticed and frowned. I could see the gears turning in his head. This wasn't supposed to happen. My evidence, my calm confidence, and the witnesses starting to record were starting to undermine their control. I took a deep breath and squared my shoulders. The next step would be critical. I couldn't let them scare me. This was my home, my street, my life, and no fake uniform or clipboard was going to take that away. And as I stood there, papers in hand, phone recording, neighbors watching, I realized something important. I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was setting an example. These imposters had underestimated me, and that mistake was going to cost them. Standing on my porch, documents in hand and phone recording discreetly, I tried to keep calm, but the reality of the situation hit me like a brick. These people weren't backing down. In fact, it felt like they were gearing up for something more. The taller officer took a deliberate step forward, the shorter one flanking him like a shadow, and suddenly the air around me seemed heavier, charged with intimidation. "You need to comply now," the taller one said, his voice low and controlled, like a judge delivering a sentence. "Refusal has consequences. We can escalate this situation immediately." I swallowed hard. Escalate? The word echoed in my head. My heart was pounding so loudly I was certain my neighbors could hear it. I glanced at them, some still cautiously watching from their porches, others holding phones, capturing every moment. A few kids had stopped riding their bikes mid-street, eyes wide, sensing the tension even if they didn't understand the details. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay composed. Humor was the only thing keeping panic at bay. "Escalate, really? What is this, a live-action HOA horror movie?" I muttered under my breath, loud enough for the nearest neighbor to hear. I swear I saw a brief twitch of a smile on someone's face behind a curtain. The shorter officer shifted, crossing his arms, and inched closer. I noticed his body language change, slightly less confident, a little hesitant. That tiny moment of doubt gave me a spark of hope. I had to play this carefully. One wrong move and it could spiral into a disaster. I decided to try reason again, even though my instinct screamed that these people weren't rational. "Listen, I've shown you my property deeds. I've explained that I'm not part of your HOA. I have nothing to hide, but I also have rights as a homeowner. You can't threaten me with arrest, you have no authority here. The taller officer's jaw tightened. Authority is not determined by membership alone. You are required to follow procedures. Your refusal is noted. My stomach dropped. Noted? Were they seriously treating this like some legal proceeding? I realized I had to assert myself more strongly. This wasn't about compliance anymore, it was about standing my ground. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, meeting his gaze. I am not showing my ID because I don't have to. You are threatening me without cause. Step back or I call the authorities immediately. His eyes flicked to my phone for the first time, where I was subtly recording everything under the guise of a call. I could see it now. They weren't used to anyone challenging them with evidence, calm composure, and witnesses. Their confidence wavered ever so slightly. You don't understand, the taller officer muttered, more to himself than to me. We can take action. I raised an eyebrow. Action? What action? You're trying to intimidate me with nothing but words and uniforms that mean nothing. I've got proof, I've got witnesses, and I've got my rights. You can't do this. The shorter officer's stance stiffened. I could feel him debating something silently, probably trying to figure out how to maintain the illusion of control. That tiny crack in their facade was all I needed. But I knew the confrontation wasn't over. They could still try to bluff, escalate, or somehow push me into compliance. I tightened my jaw, my hands gripping the railing. I wasn't going to let fear dictate my actions. I glanced at my neighbors again, phones out, whispering, some shaking their heads in disbelief. A few had even stepped a little closer, subtly signaling support. Their presence made me bolder. I could see now that I wasn't entirely alone. I decided to make one more stand. This is my home, you have no authority over me. If you try to escalate, if you try to threaten me further, it won't end the way you think. Step back. For a brief moment, the taller officer paused. I could see his expression flicker, uncertainty. My words, my calm, my evidence, and the growing audience were beginning to unnerve them. The bluff was starting to crumble. And then he said it, the words that made my pulse spike again. You're making this harder than it needs to be. One more refusal, and we'll have no choice but to take matters into our own hands. I froze, my mind raced. Take matters into their own hands? What did that even mean? But this time, instead of panic, determination coursed through me. I had proof, witnesses, and logic on my side. I wasn't just a passive homeowner anymore. I was standing up to imposters, and I wouldn't back down. I squared my shoulders, took a deep breath, and locked eyes with them. Do whatever you think you have to. I am not intimidated. I will not comply. Step back now. And with that, the standoff continued, but this time I could feel the tide slowly beginning to turn. I knew I couldn't handle this alone for much longer. The two officers weren't budging, and each time they threatened action, my heart leapt into my throat, but fear had a strange way of sharpening focus. I had proof, I had neighbors watching, and now I realized I needed to escalate, but carefully, not in panic, but with strategy. I reached for my phone, pretending to check a message, but in reality I was quietly calling a friend who knew a thing or two about HOA regulations and, more importantly, how to deal with people pretending to have authority. Hey, I whispered, trying not to let the imposters notice. I've got two fake HOA people here threatening me. I'm documenting everything. Keep this line open while I handle them. The taller officer's eyes flicked to my phone. I held it casually in front of me as though I was video calling someone who could immediately verify my claims. I could see a micro-expression of doubt flash across his face. They weren't used to pushback, certainly not with someone calmly recording evidence and speaking as if they had backup. Verification is ongoing, I said casually into the phone, so if you could just give me a moment, I'll cooperate fully once we confirm my status. My voice was calm, almost too calm, but the subtle lie that I had authority backing me felt empowering. The taller officer frowned, glancing at his partner, whose body language suddenly seemed less confident. I realized they had not accounted for someone taking control of the narrative. Most people would panic. Most would hand over an ID without thinking. But I wasn't most people. I decided to press my advantage. Look, I understand you're trying to do your job, I said, keeping my tone polite but firm. But there's a problem here. I'm not part of your HOA, and I have property records, notices, and witnesses to prove it. If you continue to threaten me without cause, that becomes harassment, not enforcement. The shorter officer's arms crossed tighter and he shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. I could see the thought forming in his head, maybe we shouldn't have picked this target. I glanced toward my neighbors, phones out, some whispering among themselves. The street was quiet now, tension hanging like fog, but I could see that they were silently supporting me. That small army of witnesses gave me courage. Then I added the final piece of pressure. And just so we're clear, I've started recording everything. This is not just about proving my rights, it's about documenting your actions. So if you think escalation is an option, you're on camera. The taller officer's face tightened. His words had lost some of their earlier bite. The bluff was faltering. He glanced at the SUV, then back at me, clearly calculating the risks now. I could practically see him realizing that intimidating a homeowner with evidence and witnesses on their side was not going to be as simple as he thought. Feeling the momentum shift, I continued. I'm more than happy to resolve this peacefully, but your threats are unnecessary. Step back, acknowledge the mistake, and we can all go on with our day. That's it. For the first time, I saw the slightest hesitation in their movements. The taller officer's jaw twitched, a signal of frustration, or maybe the dawning realization that he had underestimated me. The shorter one shifted his weight nervously. Their carefully constructed authority was cracking. I held my ground, watching their expressions, phone still recording. My heart still raced, but now I felt a thrill of empowerment. I wasn't just defending myself, I was taking control. This wasn't just about documents or property lines, it was about standing firm against people who thought appearances alone could intimidate a homeowner. I exhaled slowly. I had survived the worst of the bluff, but I knew the confrontation wasn't over. The imposters could still escalate, still try some final intimidation tactic. I had to be ready, steady, and resolute. As I tightened my grip on my property documents, I realized something important. The situation had shifted. What had started as fear was now strategy. What had begun as a threat was now an opportunity, and for the first time, I felt confident. I was ready for the next move. The next step would either break the imposter's confidence entirely or escalate things to the final showdown. Either way, I wasn't going to back down. By this point, my nerves were a tight coil of tension and anticipation, but something had shifted. The balance of power wasn't entirely in their favor anymore. I had witnesses, evidence, and the confidence that comes from knowing I was standing on solid ground, and now I was ready to call their bluff fully. I straightened, holding my property papers high and phone recording, and locked eyes with the taller officer. "All right," I said, keeping my voice calm but firm, "we're done playing games. You are not HOA officers, you have no authority over me, and I have proof." For a split second, their composure wavered. The taller one's jaw twitched, the shorter one's shoulders stiffened, and I saw a flicker of hesitation in their eyes. I knew that hesitation meant the bluff was crumbling. I started slowly walking toward them, deliberately calm, like a person who knows the game has changed. "Look at these," I said, spreading the property records and HOA maps across the porch railing. "Check the boundaries. My house is not in your jurisdiction. Every single one of these documents proves it." The shorter officer finally spoke, his voice tight. "Verification is." "I've already verified," I cut him off, my tone sharp now. "With real documents, with real neighbors, and with my phone recording everything. Step back now." They exchanged a glance. I could almost hear the silent conversation passing between them. "We miscalculated. This isn't going as planned." I realized the moment had come to escalate my own position. I raised my phone higher. "Everyone on the street is watching. My neighbors can confirm I am not part of your HOA. If you step any closer, I will call the police immediately, and you will be arrested for impersonating authority and harassment." Their eyes flicked toward the gathered neighbors, and for the first time, fear crept into their expressions. I could see the internal panic rising. They had relied on intimidation and surprise, but it was failing spectacularly. I pressed the advantage further. "I have photos of your SUV, your fake badges, and your clipboards. I'm sharing them with the HOA's real board and the police as we speak. Your bluff is over." The taller officer opened his mouth, probably to argue, but I held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "No, save it, I've seen enough. Step off my property, admit your mistake, or the authorities handle it from here. Your choice." There was a long, tense silence. The street was quiet except for the occasional murmur from my neighbors. Birds chirped nervously in the trees. The taller officer finally exhaled sharply and took a step back, a signal that their charade was officially crumbling. The shorter one muttered something under his breath, then followed suit. The SUV door slammed, tires screeched slightly, and in moments they were gone, rolling slowly down the street like a bad dream fading in the morning light. I stood there for a long moment, chest heaving, adrenaline coursing through me. The absurdity of it hit me. I had just survived a standoff with fake HOA officers threatening my arrest in my own driveway. My neighbors started clapping quietly, some laughing, others shaking their heads in disbelief. One kid even yelled, "You're a hero." I laughed, though my nerves were still jittery. Humor was the only thing that kept me grounded. "Hero? More like lucky," I muttered under my breath. But deep down, I knew I had stood my ground, used evidence and calm reasoning, and protected my home. That was real courage. Later, as I reviewed the recording, I realized something important. It wasn't just about proving a point. It wasn't just about defending myself. It was about exposing the truth, showing that fear and appearances could be challenged. That even in suburbia, where life seems quiet and predictable, you could face chaos and absurdity and still survive. By the time the real HOA board was informed, the imposter's ruse had already been documented, reported, and dismissed as fraud. Their bluff had been completely broken, and I had the evidence to prove it. I sank into my porch chair, finally allowing myself to relax. The street returned to its normal rhythm. Kids resumed their bikes, neighbors returned to chores, and the morning sun felt warm again, not threatening. I realized something as I took a slow sip of my now cold coffee. I hadn't just survived a strange, tense encounter, I had turned it around. I had taken fear and turned it into control, confusion into clarity. And I had done it all in my own driveway, standing firm against people who thought appearances alone could command compliance. It was over, or at least it seemed that way. But I knew the story would live on in the neighborhood for weeks, maybe months, retold with incredulity and laughter, and I couldn't help but smile at the absurdity of it all. After the imposters drove off, I finally allowed myself to slump into my porch chair, gripping my coffee mug like a lifeline. The adrenaline was slowly fading, leaving behind a mix of relief, disbelief, and the faint hum of lingering tension. My neighbors were cautiously coming back outside, whispers and chuckles spreading through the street. Some came over to pat my shoulder, others peeked at the papers and phone recordings that had saved the day. For a moment, I just stared at my front yard. Everything looked the same, the sun glinting off the maple leaves, the neatly mowed grass, but nothing felt the same. That quiet suburban calm I had taken for granted had been shattered, and yet somehow it felt stronger now. I had survived something surreal and absurd, and I had done it on my own terms. I started reviewing the recording I had made on my phone. Every word, every movement, every flicker of hesitation on their faces was captured. My heart raced again, not with fear this time, but with satisfaction. This was proof. This was my defense. This was my victory. Later that day, I contacted the real HOA board. They were polite, professional, and most importantly, completely unaware of the so-called officers patrolling the neighborhood. I explained the situation, sending them screenshots, recordings, and copies of the imposters' vehicle descriptions. By the end of the call, they were as shocked as I had been. "We've never authorized anyone to do that," one of them said. "You handled that well, don't worry, we'll investigate and make sure this doesn't happen again." That call was a relief, but also a reminder of how ridiculous and dangerous the situation had been. Two strangers, dressed in uniforms, claiming authority over a home they had no jurisdiction over, an absurd, almost cinematic nightmare in the middle of a quiet suburban street. As I reflected, I realized what had made the difference: composure, preparation, and a refusal to be intimidated. I hadn't panicked. I had documented, reasoned, and asserted my rights. And yes, I had used a little humor to keep my mind sharp and my heart steady. Later, as word spread through the neighborhood, the story took on a life of its own. Neighbors came by to check in, some bringing coffee, others just shaking their heads in disbelief. "I can't believe this happened here," Mrs. Patel said, laughing nervously. "I've never seen anything like it." Even Mr. Henderson, usually the self-appointed expert on all HOA matters, had no words. He just shook his head and muttered, "Well, you handled that better than I would have." I smiled, secretly proud that my calm and evidence-based strategy had earned even his reluctant respect. I couldn't help but think about the absurdity of the morning. Two fake officers showing up, threatening me in my own driveway, expecting fear to do their work for them. And yet, when faced with clear evidence, witnesses, and someone who refused to comply blindly, their authority vanished like smoke. The whole experience left me with a few clear lessons. First, documentation matters. Always have your property deeds, records, and evidence handy. Second, composure is your most powerful tool in tense situations. Fear gives the other side an advantage, calm gives you one. And third, never underestimate the power of witnesses. Sometimes just being seen and heard is enough to break a bluff. By the evening, the neighborhood had settled back into its usual rhythm. Kids were riding bikes again, sprinklers turned on, and the quiet hum of suburbia returned. My porch, once the scene of a bizarre standoff, felt safe again, but I knew I wouldn't forget that morning: the absurdity, the tension, the fear, and ultimately the triumph. I poured myself another cup of coffee, the steam curling lazily in the fading light. I sat back, letting the events replay in my mind. Humor, strategy, and courage had won the day. I had defended my home, my rights, and my sanity, all without giving in to intimidation. And as I watched the sunset over my quiet neighborhood, I realized something important. You can't always predict the chaos that comes knocking at your door, but you can control how you respond. And sometimes, just standing firm with truth, evidence, and a little humor is enough to turn a threatening situation into a story you'll laugh about later. For now, my driveway was mine again. The imposters were gone, the real HOA reassured, and my street had returned to its calm suburban rhythm. I took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth fill me. The morning had started ordinary, but it ended with a victory I would never forget. And as the final light faded behind the trees, I couldn't help but smile, knowing that sometimes courage and calmness, paired with a little stubbornness, could outmatch even the boldest of threats. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.